They took Emme at first light, 3 men in Rask colors and a wagon with iron rings on the bed. My daughter was 2.5 years old, still warm from sleep, her hand fisted in the collar of my coat. She did not cry. She pressed 2 fingers to the hollow of her own throat, the way she did when the world got too loud. And she watched the men the way she watched everything, steady, cataloging, older than her years. I stood in the doorway of a shop that was not mine anymore, and I understood that I was being paid, that my father had died owing a debt I could not read the bottom of, and that the debt had a face now, and the face had come to the Amber Quays to collect. The woman who owned the wagon did not raise her voice. She looked at my child for a long moment, and something moved behind her eyes that I would spend a season trying to name. And she said 4 words to the man beside her that I would hear in my sleep for a long time after.
If this story stayed with you, hit subscribe so the next one can find you. Stay close.
She said blood, not coin. If you want to hear uncensored, too hot for YouTube stories, check out my Patreon in the description. Tell us where you are watching from and subscribe. I want to back up first. My name is Cosima Renwick, and in the city of Verano I was nobody, which in Verano is its own kind of safety. We were northern people. My father Emile brought us south when I was a child, over the mountains and down into the white stone and the red tile and the hot gold light. And he opened a watch and pawn shop on the Amber Quays, because a man who mends time can eat anywhere. That was what he used to say. A man who mends time never starves. He was wrong about that in the end. But he believed it, and I grew up believing it too, in the smell of clock oil and brass filings, in the ticking that filled our 2 small rooms above the shop, 100 small hearts, keeping 100 different times. The Amber Quays were syndicate ground. Everything in Verano was syndicate ground. But the Quays especially, the pawn district, the bonded warehouses, the salt and the olive oil, and the small desperate transactions of people who had run out of everything except the last thing they owned. The Rask family held the Quays. You paid them the way you paid the tide. My father paid, and near the end he borrowed to pay. And that is a hole that has no bottom. And he went into it without telling me how deep it went, because he was proud and because I had Emme by then, and he did not want me to be afraid. He died in the spring, quietly in his chair, with a half-mended pocket watch open on the table in front of him, and his loupe still in his eye. I closed the shop for one day. On the second day the ledger came due, and I opened the book he had kept, and I saw the number at the bottom. And I understood that a man who mends time can, in fact, starve, and that he can take his daughter and his granddaughter down into the dark with him without ever meaning to. I want to tell you what Emme was like, before the wagon, so that you understand what they took. She was small and grave, and she counted things. She had my mother's hands, long-fingered, and she had a way of pressing 2 fingers to the hollow of her throat when a room got loud. A small private gesture, a way of holding on to herself. She had a color in her eyes that I had never been able to place and had stopped trying to. Gray, mostly, flint. But at the center, in certain light, a ring of warm amber, like a coal under ash. Strangers commented on it. I always said she got it from her father, and I always changed the subject, because Emme's father was a subject with no bottom, like the ledger, and I had learned to keep the lid on both. I had one thing of my mother's, a single button, mother of pearl, cut from a coat that was long gone, worn smooth as a coin, threaded on a gray cord I wore under my collar. When I was frightened, I held it. When I could not sleep, I turned it in my fingers and counted the ticking of my father's clocks through the floor. It was not much. It was all I had that was only mine. That is who we were. The morning the wagon came. A dead man's debt, a grave little girl with a coal in her eye, and a woman with a button and no plan. I did not know yet that the woman who owned the wagon had been to my shop before. I did not know that she had come once, 3 winters back, out of a storm, with no name and a watch that had stopped. I had forgotten her. I had made myself forget her. That was the miscalculation. Everything that happened after came from the thing I had made myself forget. Let me tell you how they took her. The Rask family did not send soldiers to the Amber Quays for a widow's debt. They sent a clerk with a writ and 2 men with a wagon. And that was worse, because soldiers you can be afraid of in a clean way. But a clerk with a writ is the law of the place standing in your doorway in a pressed coat, and there is nothing clean about it at all. The clerk read the number. It was the number from my father's book. And then it was a larger number, the way numbers are always larger when they are read aloud by someone in a pressed coat. He said the shop was forfeit. He said the stock was forfeit, the tools, the clocks, the loop still sitting on the table where my father had left it. And then he said the part I had not known a writ could say. He said that where a debt exceeded the seizable goods, the family reserved the right to hold the debtor's household in bond until the balance was cleared through service, and that the household in law included the minor child. I did not understand it. I understand it now. It is an old cruelty dressed as an old mercy. It means they can take your labor, and they can take the thing your labor is for, and they can call it holding you safe. I said no. It was not a strategy. It was just the word, the only word I had, and I said it in the doorway with Emme's fist in my collar, and one of the men reached for her, and I put myself between them, and that was when the third figure came down off the wagon. She was not what I expected. I had built the Rask family in my head out of the men who came to the quays. Heavy men, loud men, men who leaned. She was none of that. She was somewhere near 40, and she was built like a blade rather than a wall. And she wore black without a single thing on it to catch the light. No rings, no chain. And her hair was cut short and swept back, black, severe, and her coloring was the olive tan of a person who lived in the sun instead of hiding from it. There was a thin, pale scar through one eyebrow. She moved with the particular economy of someone who had learned, a long time ago, never to make a motion she did not mean. And her eyes, when she turned them on me, were gray, flint gray. And at the center, in the hot morning light coming off the water, a ring of warm amber, like a coal under ash. I did not let myself see it. You have to understand that. I had spent 3 winters not seeing it. A person can train themselves out of a truth, the way you train a dog out of a room. And I had trained hard. And so I stood in that doorway, and I looked at that woman's eyes, and I did not see my daughter in them, because I could not afford to, because the wagon was right there. She looked at Emme, not at me, at Emme, who had gone still, the way she went still, 2 fingers at her throat, watching this stranger with her whole grave attention. And the woman went still too. For 1 second, too, the whole loud morning on the quays seemed to hold its breath, and something crossed her face. Fast, there and gone, like the shadow of a bird across a wall. Then she said, to the man reaching for my child, without heat, without raising her voice at all, she said, "Not like that." The man stopped. She said, "The child rides with the mother, in the front, and someone find the girl her coat." I said, "Who are you?" And she looked at me then, finally, and I felt the full weight of the gray and the amber. And she said her name the way you set a stone down on a table so it cannot be argued with. She said, "Vittoria Rask." The dawn. Not a man leaning on my counter, the head of the family that owned the tide. She had come herself for a widow's debt on the Amber Quays, and I did not know why, and I would not let myself know why. And she watched me not know it with an expression I could not read, and then she turned and gave an order about my father's clocks, that they were to be wrapped, not sold, everyone, and loaded whole. Wrapped, not sold. I heard it, and I did not understand it, and I filed it away with the other thing I did not understand. The 4 words, blood, not coin. And I climbed up into the front of the wagon with my daughter in my lap, and I let the Rask family carry us off the only ground I had. Emme did not cry the whole way. She sat in my lap, and she watched the back of the Don's head where she rode ahead of us on a gray horse. And once, only once, she took her 2 fingers from her own throat and she reached them out, small, toward the woman on the horse, the way a child reaches towards something she recognizes, and I caught her hand and folded it back into my collar, and I told myself she was reaching at the horse. There was something I did not yet know. There were a great many things I did not yet know, but the first one, the one that everything else grew out of, was already sitting up on that gray horse ahead of us, riding us home, and it had a coal in its eye, the same as my daughter, and it would not turn around and let me see it, not for a long time yet. Casa Rask was not what I expected either. I had expected a fortress. It was a house, an old white palazzo built around a courtyard, up above the quays where the air was cleaner, with a colonnade of pale arches and a floor of worn ochre tile, and, in the center of the courtyard, a marble fountain that had gone dry, its basin full of nothing but dead leaves and the hot Verano light. Lemon trees grew in terracotta pots along the colonnade, and their smell was the first thing, before anything, the sharp green smell of lemons in the heat. And I have never since smelled a lemon without being back in that courtyard on that first afternoon, holding my daughter, waiting to find out what we were now. They gave us a room. That was the second thing I did not expect. Not a cell. A room on the courtyard side with a bed and a window and a chest, cool tiled floor, and someone had put a smaller cot beside the bed, low with a rail, a child's cot, and it had been made up with clean linen. And I stood in the doorway holding Emme, and I looked at that cot, and I could not make it fit anything I understood about being seized for a debt. An old woman showed us the room. She was near 70, small, with iron gray hair pinned tight and hands that never stopped, folding, smoothing. And she moved through Casa Rask like she had grown out of its floors. Her name was Benedetta. Everyone called her Betta. She had, I would learn, raised Vittoria Rask from a motherless child, and she was the only person in that house who was not afraid of the dawn, and the only person the dawn was, in some small buried way, afraid of. Betta looked at Emme for a long time in the doorway of that room, longer than a stranger looks at a child. She looked at the gray eyes and the coal in them, and the two fingers at the throat, and then she looked at me, and I saw her see it, all of it in one breath, the way old women see things, and I braced for her to say it. She did not say it. She said, "The little one will want feeding." And she said, "Watch her hands, the Dawn's, when you can." And she went out, and I did not know what she meant. And I sat down on the edge of the bed in a house that owned me, and I held my grave little girl, and I counted the beat of my own heart, because there were no clocks here, no ticking, and the silence of a house without clocks is a terrible thing to a person who grew up inside time. That first night I did not sleep. I sat by the window, and I turned the button in my fingers, mother of pearl, smooth as a coin, and I watched the dry fountain fill up with moonlight instead of water. And I made myself a plan the way you make yourself a plan when you have no pieces to move. I would work, I would clear the number, I would keep my head down and my mouth shut, and I would get my daughter out of the house that owned her, and I would not, under any circumstances, let myself look at the Dawn's eyes and see the coal. I lasted 3 days. On the 4th day, she came back early. I had not seen her since the wagon. I had seen the house move around her absence, the way a house moves around a fire it cannot see. Everyone tuned to a door that had not opened. I had done small work. Mending, because it turned out that was the service. They had learned I could stitch, and they set me to the fine coats. The family's coats, black wool that cost more than my father's shop. And I sat in a cool room off the courtyard with a needle, and I mended other people's clothes, and I listened for a wagon, and told myself I was listening for nothing. On the 4th day, she came back early, and Emme was in the courtyard. I had let her out of my sight for the length of a dropped spool. That was all. I was on my knees on the tile chasing a spool of gray thread under a bench, and when I stood up, my daughter was gone from the doorway, and my heart went through the floor, and I came out into the colonnade and the hot light, and there she was, in the middle of the dry fountain's shadow, and there, crouched down on her heels in front of her, at my daughter's exact eye level, was the Dawn of the Rask family. I stopped, I did not make a sound. I have never in my life wanted so badly to cross a courtyard and been so unable to move. Vittoria Rask was crouched in the dust in her black coat, and she was not touching my child. Her hands were resting loose on her own knees, deliberately, I understood later, deliberately not reaching, and she was looking at Emme. And Emme was looking at her, and neither of them was saying anything. Two grave, still creatures with the same coal in their eyes, taking each other's measure across a foot of hot tile. Then Emme lifted 2 fingers and pressed them to the hollow of her own throat. And Vittoria Rask, without seeming to know she did it, lifted 2 fingers and pressed them to the hollow of her own throat. The same gesture. The exact same gesture. I saw it happen, and I felt the whole careful structure I had built over 3 winters lean and creak and begin very slowly to come down. She had not taught Emme that. Emme had not taught her. It was not a thing that could be taught. It was a thing that came down in the blood, from one grave still person who needed to hold on to herself in a loud world, to another. And it had come down across 3 winters and a war, and the whole cruel machinery of a debt, and it was sitting there in the dust of a dry fountain. Undeniable. And I was the only one watching. And I put my hand over my mouth so I would not make a sound. Vittoria looked up and saw me, and for one moment her face was open. All the way open, the way I would only see it 2 more times in the whole season. And there was something in it that was not a dawn at all, something young and unhealed and afraid. And then it closed the way a hand closes, and she stood up out of the dust and she became the dawn again. And she said, she wandered. I said, I'm sorry. I came forward and I took Emme up, and Emme let me, but she kept her gray eyes on the woman in black over my shoulder and reached back toward her, small, the way she had reached from the wagon. Vittoria did not reach back. I watched her not reach back. I watched it cost her something. She took a stopped gold watch out of her coat, a hunter watch, the case worn smooth, and she pressed the crown with her thumb. Once, the way you would wind a watch, except she did not wind it, she just pressed the crown and held it, a small private motion. And I recognized it. I recognized it the way you recognize your own name called in a crowd, because it was the motion of a person holding on to herself in a loud world, and my daughter did it with 2 fingers at her throat, and the Dawn of the Rask family did it with her thumb on the crown of a watch that did not run. Watch her hands, Betta had said. I said, that watch is stopped. I don't know why I said it. It came out of the watchmender's daughter in me, the one thing I knew, the one ground I had. Vittoria looked at the watch in her hand as if she had forgotten it was there, or forgotten I could see it. And something went across her face and she put it away. She said yes. I said, I could look at it, if you wanted. It's what I do. The whole courtyard was very quiet. A lemon dropped somewhere behind us in the heat. A soft thud on the tile. She looked at me for a long moment with the gray and the coal, and I felt her weigh the offer, weigh it like it was heavier than it was. And then she said, no, low, final. And under it, so quiet I almost missed it. So quiet I have never been sure she meant me to hear. She said, not yet. And she turned and went into the house, and I stood in the courtyard with my daughter reaching over my shoulder toward a closed door, and the button burned at my throat, and I finally, let myself think the sentence I had refused to think for 3 winters. The traveler, the storm, the watch that had stopped. I have to tell you about the traveler now, or none of the rest of it makes sense. 3 winters before the wagon, before Emme, my father was still alive and the shop still ran, and I was 23, and I thought the worst thing that could happen to me was the debt. There was a storm off the sea, a bad one, the kind that comes down the coast in autumn and shuts the quays for 2 days. And on the first night of it, past closing, someone knocked at the shop door, and against my father's rule I opened it, because it was coming down like the end of the world out there. And there was a woman on the step, soaked through with no name and a watch that had stopped. She would not say who she was. She had money, good money, and she said she needed a dry corner for a night and a watch mended, and she said it in the flat voice of a person who was being hunted and would not say so. My father was asleep. I should have woken him. I did not. I let her in, and I gave her the dry corner, and by candlelight, with the storm throwing the sea against the quays, I opened up her watch. It was a good watch, an old Hunter gold, and it had stopped because of a broken mainspring, and I told her I could fix it, but it would take the night, and she said she had the night, and so I worked, and she watched me work, and we talked in the low way two strangers talk when a storm has sealed them in together, and neither of them expects to see the other again. She had a scar through one eyebrow. She had gray eyes with a coal at the center. She was somewhere near 36, and she was built like a blade, and when she smiled, which was twice, it changed her whole face into something I have never stopped seeing. I am not going to tell you the rest of that night on YouTube. There are parts of it I can only tell you on Patreon, but I will tell you that the watch was running by morning, ticking clean and true in my hand, and that the storm had blown out, and that when I came down at first light, she was already gone, and the watch was gone with her. And there was money on the counter. Too much money, and no name, and no note. And I stood in the empty shop with the whole night still close around me, and I understood that I had been left, kindly, the way you leave something you cannot keep. I did not know she had been called back to a war. I did not know there was a Rask family war that autumn, that the old Don was dying, and the succession was blood, and that a woman near 36 had gone to ground on the Amber Quays for one night with no name because there were people in her own house who wanted her dead before she could rise. I learned all of that later. That night, I only knew that a stranger had come out of a storm and mended something in me while I mended something in her, and had gone before the light and had taken the watch. 9 months later, I had Emme, gray eyes, coal at the center, and hands that pressed to her own throat when the world got loud. I never looked for the traveler. What would I have said? I did not even have a name. And more than that, I was afraid. A specific fear, the fear that lives in people who have nothing. That if the person who left the money ever learned about the child, she would come and take the child because people with money take. That is what they do. That is the whole shape of the world from the bottom of it. A nameless father was not a wound. A nameless father was a wall. It kept my daughter mine. So I built the wall, and I trained myself out of the room, and I raised my grave little girl in the ticking of my father's clocks, and I did not let myself do the arithmetic of her eyes. And then my father died, owing the Rask family more than a watch shop is worth, and the Dawn came herself to collect, and crouched in the dust of a dry fountain, and pressed 2 fingers to her own throat without knowing she did it. I sat by the window that 4th night, and I did the arithmetic. All of it. And it came out the way I had always known it would come out, the way I had refused for 3 winters to let it come out. And I put my face in my hands, in a house that owned me, and I was more afraid than I had ever been in my life, because the wall was down, and the person on the other side of it was the Dawn of the Rask family, and she had my daughter under her roof, in a cot she had ordered made, and she had known. I understood now. She had known the moment she saw Emme's eyes on the keys. She had known, and she had not taken her. She had taken us, both of us, into a room with a window and a lemon tree and clean linen on a child's cot. I did not understand it yet, but I had stopped being able to pretend there was nothing to understand. Here is the thing I want you to understand about the season that followed, because it is the true shape of the whole story, and the part that no Ritter wagon can hold. She never crossed the distance. Understand what that means. She was the Dawn of the Rask family. She owned the ground I stood on, and the roof over my daughter, and the number at the bottom of my father's book. There was no wall in that house she could not have walked through, no door she could not have opened, no thing she could not have simply reached out and taken, because that is what the word dawn means. It means the one who takes. And she did not. Week after week, she held a distance between us that she could have closed with one step. And she held it the way I had seen her do everything, with the particular economy of a person who never makes a motion she does not mean. I understood slowly that the distance was the mercy, that she was terrified of a specific thing, that she had learned somewhere, in the war that made her, that a thing taken is not a thing kept, and that she had a coal in her eye and a daughter in her house and a debt she could have used to own us forever, and that she would rather hold a distance until it killed her than close it with a debt in her hand. Because a claim made to collect a debt is a cage with a kinder name. And she had decided, before I understood any of it, that if she could not have us freely, she would not have us at all. She just could not make herself let us go either. That was the whole war of her, that season. She could not take and she could not release, and so she held at arm's length in a house full of lemon trees, and I watched her hold, and it undid me more thoroughly than any taking ever could have. Let me show you how it went. The first week passed in the strange suspended quiet of a house being run by a woman I rarely saw. She left before light and came back after dark, and the house tuned itself to the door, and I mended coats and learned the names of the servants and kept Emme close. But things happened in the house that I could not account for. The clocks came, all of my father's clocks, wrapped, not sold, carried up from the shop in the wagon and stored in a dry room off the courtyard. And one afternoon, I found the door to that room unlocked, and a workbench moved into it. A good bench with a lamp, and my father's tools laid out on a cloth. The loop, the fine drivers, the little brass vices, arranged the way a person arranges tools they have watched someone use. No one said anything about it. I stood in the doorway, and I understood that someone had watched me closely at the shop, on the quays, long before the wagon. That someone knew I mended time, that someone had carried 100 clocks up a hill rather than sell them, and set my father's bench in a dry room and left the door unlocked. I did not thank her. I did not know how to thank her for a thing she would not admit to doing. But that night, I went into the room and I lit the lamp and I mended one of my father's clocks, a small carriage clock, and I set it running, and I left it on the bench ticking in the dark, and the next morning it was still there, still running, and beside it, on the cloth, someone had left a broken pocket watch, not the stopped gold hunter, a different one, a small cheap thing, plainly broken, plainly a test, or a question, or an offering. I could not tell which. I mended it. I left it running beside the first, and so it began, the only language we had that season, broken things left in the dark and mended by morning, a conversation carried on entirely in clocks, because neither of us could yet carry it in words. Why was she being kind to me? I lay awake on that question. She had every reason in the world not to be, and a debt in her hand that made kindness unnecessary, and she was kind anyway. In this buried, wordless way, in cots and benches and unlocked doors, and I could not make the arithmetic of it come out to anything except the coal in her eye and the coal in my daughter's. And I was not ready, that first week, to let it come out to that. By the second week, Emme had decided, children decide faster than the rest of us, and with less fear. And Emme had taken one long, grave look at the woman in black across a dry fountain and had decided that she belonged to her, and there was no arguing with it. She waited for the dawn. She would station herself in the colonnade near the door in the late afternoon, 2 fingers at her throat, watching the arch. And when Vittoria came through it, my daughter would go still all over with a kind of held joy. Not running, Emme never ran, just standing very straight and waiting to be seen. And Vittoria saw her, every time, however late, However gray her own face with whatever she had spent the day doing, she would come through the arch and she would find my daughter in the colonnade and she would stop, and something in her would ease, one notch visibly, and she would crouch down to Emme's level, always down to her level, and she would not touch her. And she would say some small grave thing, and Emme would answer in her small grave way, and the two of them would have a whole conversation in the failing light that I was never quite close enough to hear. Once I heard the end of it. I was coming through the colonnade with an armful of mending, and I heard Emme say, in her clear, small voice, "Are you my mama's friend?" And I stopped, out of sight, and I heard the silence stretch, and I heard Vittoria Rask, the dawn of the family that owned the tide, say very carefully, like a person laying a coin down on glass, "I would like to be." And Emme said, "Okay, just that." Okay, the whole treaty of them, in a word, and I stood behind a pillar with my arms full of another family's coats, and I cried without a sound and did not fully know why. She never picked Emme up. I want you to notice that. All season. She crouched, she talked, she once, in the dry room, guided my daughter's small hand to the pendulum of a clock and let her feel it swing, but she never lifted her, never gathered her up, the way your whole body wants to gather up a child who is standing there waiting to be gathered. And I understood, watching it, that she would not let herself have that either, not until it was given, not until it was free. And the discipline of it, the sheer held ache of it, was the most unguarded thing I had ever watched a person do. On the fourth night of the third week, she came back hurt. Not badly. I never learned how. The Rask family had trouble that season, out on the quays in the warehouses. The kind of trouble that does not get spoken of in front of the woman who mends the coats. And one night, she came through the arch late with her right hand wrapped in a cloth gone dark. And Emme was not in the colonnade. I had kept her in. It was too late. And so it was only me, sitting in the dry room with the lamp and a clock, when Vittoria passed the open door. She stopped. She looked in at me and the lamp and the running clocks, and I saw that she was very tired all the way down, and that the hand hurt her more than she would say, and I stood up without thinking, and I said, "Let me." I meant the hand. She knew I meant the hand, and I watched her want to say no, the way she said no to everything she wanted, and I watched her not quite manage it. She came into the room and she sat on the stool across the bench from me, and she laid her wrapped hand on the cloth among my father's tools, and she let me unwind the cloth. It was a bad cut across the back of the hand and 2 knuckles, clean, already closing, but it needed to be washed and wrapped right. And I did it in the lamplight, with the clocks ticking around us, and neither of us said anything for a long time. Her hand was warm and heavy in mine, and it did not shake, and she watched my face the whole time, not the hand, my face, with the gray and the coal. And I have never been looked at like that before or since, like a thing being memorized against a coming absence. When I finished, I did not let go of her hand right away. I don't know why. I held it a moment longer than I needed to, there in the light, and the whole room was very quiet, only the clocks. And she let me hold it, and I felt the exact moment she almost turned her hand over in mine. Almost, the small preparatory shift of it. And then she did not. She drew it back, slowly, carefully, and she stood up and she said, "Lo, thank you." And then she said the other thing, the thing I did not understand until much later. She said, "You shouldn't be kind to me." I said, "Why not?" She was at the door. She did not turn around. She said, "Because it makes it harder to let you go." And she went, and I sat in the dry room with the clocks and my father's tools and my own 2 empty hands. And I understood that we were both holding a distance now from opposite seas, and that neither of us could name why to the other, and that the not naming was its own kind of touch, The only kind we had. Emme took a fever on the 9th night of the 4th week. It came up fast, the way it comes up in small children, nothing at supper. And then, by the middle of the night, a burning little body in the cot, and a cough that scared me. And I did what you do. I got the water and the cloths, and I sat on the tiled floor in the dark, and I held her, and I counted her breaths, because there were no clocks in that room to count instead. She was so hot. And I was a stranger in a house that owned me, with no doctor I could call and no money to call one with. And I sat on the floor of Cosima Rask at the worst hour of the night, and I was as frightened as a person can be. I did not hear the door. I never heard her doors. But at some point I looked up, and Vittoria Rask was standing in the doorway of the room with a candle, in a plain dark shirt with no coat, her short hair unswept, looking younger and unarmored than I had ever seen her. And she did not come in. She stood in the doorway, one hand on the frame, and she looked at the burning child in my arms. And I watched her whole body want to cross the room. And I watched her hold the doorway instead, because she would not come into the room I slept in. Not even for this. Not while a debt stood between us and made everything she did a thing she could be accused of buying. She said low, "How long?" I said, "Since midnight. It won't break." She was gone before I finished the sentence. And a quarter hour later, Betta came, with a doctor behind her, a real one, roused out of bed and brought up the hill in the dark, and a basket of the right things, the tincture, the syrup, the cool green stuff that a doctor charges a season's stitching for, and none of it was spoken of. None of it. And I understood that somewhere in the dark house, the Dawn of the Rask family had done the only thing she would let herself do, which was to pay, from a distance, out of sight, and send other hands to do the touching. The fever broke near dawn. And when it broke, and Emme finally slept, cool and damp and small in the cot, I came out into the colonnade to breathe, and Vittoria was there. She had not gone to bed. She was sitting on the low wall of the dry fountain in her plain shirt, with the dead night around her, and there was a cup of coffee beside her, gone stone cold and filmed over, untouched, the way a thing goes cold beside a person who forgot they had it. And I understood she had sat there the whole night, close enough to be told, far enough not to be accused, waiting to hear whether my daughter would live. I sat down on the wall beside her, not touching, a hand's breadth of cold marble between us. I said, "She's sleeping." It broke. Vittoria let out a breath I do not think she knew she had been holding for 4 hours. She did not look at me. She looked at the dry basin, at the gray light beginning to come up over the colonnade, and after a while she said, "My mother died of a fever, here, in this house. I was 6, and she said, I have not been able to be in a room with one since." And that was all. That was the most she ever told me of herself unasked. The whole of it. 6 years old and a fever and a room she could not enter. And it explained the doorway and the candle and the cold coffee and the doctor sent up in the dark. And I did not say anything because there was nothing to say. I just sat beside her on the cold marble in the coming light, a hand's breadth apart, and let her not be alone with it, which was the only thing either of us knew how to give. After the fever, the house knew. You cannot hide a thing like that in a house. A Don who sits up a whole night on a fountain wall for a servant's child. And by the 5th week, the servants had a way of going quiet when I came through. And the family had a way of watching. And Betta took to finding me in the mending room more often than the mending needed. Her hands never stopping, folding, smoothing. And I understood she was standing a kind of guard. Once she said it plain. She sat down across from me with a basket of the Dawn's shirts and she said, "They are counting, child. The house is counting. And a house that counts is a house that will present a bill." She looked at me with her old eyes and she said, "She has been alone a long time, my girl. Longer than you think." She learned young that everything she wanted got used against her, so she stopped wanting where anyone could see. And now here she is, wanting in front of the whole house, and not able to stop and not able to say it. And Betta reached across the mending and put one old hand flat on my wrist, the only time she ever touched me, and she said, Do not let her carry it alone. She will try. It is the only way she knows. Do not let her. I did not know yet what she meant. I would know 3 days later in the account hall. But I sat there with a coat in my lap and the old woman's hand on my wrist, and I felt the shape of the coming thing move under the surface of that quiet house, the way you feel a tide turn under a boat. And I was afraid of it. And I was ready for it, both at once. There was a wall in the house I used to walk along in the false cool before the heat came up, the long white wall of the East Colonnade. And one morning I came around it, and she was there. And we both stopped, a body's length apart, in the pale early light. And for a moment, neither of us moved. I had the button in my fingers. I always had the button in my fingers by then. She looked at it, the small, worn, mother-of-pearl disc on its gray cord, and she said, "What is that?" I said, "My mother's. It's all I have of her." She looked at it a long moment, and then she did a thing I did not expect. She reached up, slowly, to her own collar, and she drew out, on a cord of her own, the stopped gold watch, and she held it in her open palm between us. In the early light, the two of us standing a body's length apart along a white wall, each holding the one thing we carried. And she said, "This is all I have of a night I can't get back." The whole world went very still. I said, "When did it stop?" And she looked at me, the gray and the coal, and she said, 3 autumns ago, in a storm, and then it ran for a while, and then it stopped again, and I have never been able to start it since, and I won't let anyone else try. I could not breathe. The east wall, the pale light, the lemon smell, the two of us and our 2 carried things. She knew. Of course she knew. She had known on the keys, and she was telling me she knew, here, in the only way she could, in a stopped watch held out in an open palm. And she was not taking, and she was not asking. She was just standing there, letting me see the thing she carried, the way I had let her see mine. And the distance between us was 1 step wide and 3 winters deep, and neither of us crossed it. I said, "I mend watches." She said, "I know." I said I could start it. And Vittoria Rask closed her hand around the watch, gently, and put it away, and said, "Not yet." And under it, the way she always said the rest of it, so quiet I almost missed it, she said, "Not while I own you." And she walked on down the white wall in the early light, and left me there with my hand at my mother's button. And I understood the whole shape of her at last, all of it, in one piece. She would not start her life again with a debt in her hand. She would not let me mend the stopped thing while she owned me, because a thing mended under a debt is not mended, it is bought. And she had decided, somewhere in the war that made her, that she would carry a stopped watch to her grave before she would buy the one thing she wanted. I went back to the mending room, and I sat down, and I did not pick up a needle for an hour, because I understood now that there was only one way this ended well, not her taking us. Not the debt cleared through my service, and my daughter and me sent quietly back down to an empty shop. The only way it ended well was if the thing between us was made free, all the way free, out in the open, where no one could call it a debt or a taking, and I did not that morning have any idea how a person with a button and no plan makes a thing like that free. I found out 3 days later when Renzo Malisse called the settlement. Renzo Malisse was Vittoria's own lieutenant, and he had watched, the way jealous men watch, and he had counted, the way jealous men count, and he had reached a conclusion that was almost the truth, and entirely poisoned. He saw a dawn who had carried a widow's clocks up a hill and set her a bench. He saw a dawn who came through the arch every night looking for a servant's child. He saw a dawn going soft. In his reading of it, a dawn building a private weakness right in the middle of Casa Rask. And to a man like Renzo Malisse, a dawn's weakness is not a tragedy. It is an opening. And so he did the thing that would break it. He did not go to Vittoria, he went to the family. He called a settlement of the accounts, which was his right, an old right, the reckoning of the family's debts in open council, and he put on the table the Renwick debt, my father's number, unpaid, and he made a motion under the old law. He moved that the debtor's household, being held in bond, be liquidated to clear the balance, the service sold on, the goods sold on, and the minor child, being an wasset of the bonded household with no established sire and no claim of blood upon her, be sold on separately, as was the family's ancient and ugly right, to the best price, to clear what a widow's stitching could not. He said the last part looking at Vittoria. Baseborn, he said, no sire, no blood, no claim, an asset like any other. And unless the Don wished to declare some reason the child could not be sold, some interest, some claim of her own, he moved that the account be settled in full at the next council, 3 days on. It was a trap, and it was a beautiful one. If Vittoria let it happen, she lost us, sold off separately into the dark, and Renzo would have proven the Don had no weakness after all, only property, which is what a Don is supposed to have. And if Vittoria stopped it, if she stood up in council and declared an interest in a baseborn child on the Amber Quays, she declared her weakness out loud to the whole family. She handed Renzo the exact thing he wanted. A Don who wants, a Don who can be moved, a Don with a soft place a knife can find. Either way he won. Either he took the thing she loved, or he exposed that she loved it. I learned all this from Betta, who learned everything, in the mending room, in a low voice, with her hands never stopping. She told me, and then she looked at me with her old eyes, and she said the thing that changed it. She said, "The Don will fall on the knife for you. She has already decided. She will stand up in that council and declare her interest and let them see the soft place, because she would rather bleed than let them sell the little one." And Betta leaned in and she said, "And it will ruin her child. A Don they can move is a Don they will move, and then unseat and then bury. She will trade her whole house for the two of you, and she will do it without a word to you, because that is how she loves. She loves by paying. She has never once in her life let anyone pay for her." I sat in the mending room with a coat in my lap and my mother's button in my hand, and I saw it clearly for the first time. She was going to save us the way her whole life had taught her to save things, by paying, by putting herself on the table and settling the account with her own body, her own name, her own house, and asking nothing, and letting me be a thing that had happened to her, a thing she had rescued, a debt she had eaten. And if she did it that way, we would be free and she would be ruined, and the thing between us would never once have been free. It would always have been a rescue, a taking dressed as a mercy, the very cage she had spent all season refusing to build. I would not let it be that. I did not have a house or a name or a family or a single card to play. I had a button and a stopped watch I knew how to start, and a grave little girl with a coal in her eye, and the one thing Vittoria Rask had never once let herself have, which was to be paid for. And I understood sitting there what free had to mean. It could not be her declaring an interest in me. It had to be me declaring one in her, in open council, out loud, not rescued, choosing. The debtor standing up in the reckoning of the accounts and saying the thing the Don was too proud and too afraid to let anyone say for her. I went to find Nino the gate boy because I needed to know how a person who is property gets herself into a settlement of the accounts, and I needed to know it before Vittoria found out what I meant to do. Because if she found out, she would stop me. She would lock me in a room with a lemon tree to keep me safe. She would fall on the knife alone. And I was done letting her pay. The council met in the account hall of Cosima Renwick, a long, cool room with a floor of black and white tile and a single long table, and the family ranged along it. And it met at midday with the shutters half closed against the heat, bars of hot gold light falling across the black and white floor. I was not summoned. Bonded property is not summoned to the settlement of the accounts. It is disposed of there. I came anyway. Nino got me to the door and Betta got me through it, and I walked into the account hall of the Rask family with my daughter's future on the table and my mother's button at my throat, and I was so afraid I could hear my own blood. Renzo Malisse was speaking when I came in. He had the number in his hand, my father's number, and he was reading it the way the clerk had read it in my doorway, larger with every line, and he was moving in his smooth, poisoned way, that the account be settled, the household liquidated, the base-born child sold separate to clear the balance. And at the head of the table sat Vittoria Rask, very still, her face shut like a door, and I saw her hand on the table, and I saw her thumb press the crown of the stopped watch once and hold it, the small private motion of a person holding on to herself in a loud room, and I knew she was about to stand up and fall on the knife. I spoke first. I said, "The child is not base-born." The whole room turned. It is a strange thing to have a whole room of dangerous people turn and look at you all at once. I felt Vittoria's eyes come to me last and widest, and I saw the alarm go through her, the pure fear, because she knew what I was about to do, and she could not stop it without doing the very thing that would ruin her. And I looked away from her, because if I looked at her, I would lose my nerve, and I looked at Renzo Malisse instead, and I said it to him. I said, "You say she has no sire and no blood and no claim. You're wrong on all three. I know her sire. I have always known. And I hid it for 3 winters because I was afraid a woman with money would take my daughter for her blood the way your family takes everything, as property, as a thing owed. That was my fear, and it was a good fear. And I was wrong." I took the button from my throat and I held it in my open hand, and I don't know why except that I needed something of my own to hold on to in that room. And I said, 3 autumns ago, a woman came out of a storm into my father's shop with no name and a watch that had stopped. I mended the watch, and in the morning she was gone, and I never learned her name. And 9 months later I had a daughter with gray eyes and a coal at the center and a way of pressing 2 fingers to her own throat when a room gets loud. I looked at Emme's father then. I finally let myself look. Vittoria Rask sat at the head of the table with her face coming open, all the way open, the third and last time I ever saw it. And her thumb had gone still on the crown of the stopped watch, and I looked at the gray and the coal in her eyes, my daughter's eyes, and I said to her, in front of the whole family, the thing she had been too afraid to let anyone say. I said, "She is your blood. Emme is your blood. You knew it on the keys. You've known it all season. And you took us as a debt so that no one in this room could call it what it is, so that you'd never have to say it and be seen wanting something. And you were going to stand up just now and buy us free and let it ruin you and never once let me choose." I said, "I'm choosing. Here, in front of your whole family where no one can ever call it a rescue. Not because you own me. You don't own me. The debt is a lie. You never wanted the coin. I'm choosing you because 3 winters ago you came out of a storm and I have not stopped, not for one day. And I hid it out of fear, and I am done being afraid. So there's your interest, Malice. There's your claim of blood. The child has a sire, and the sire is your Don, and the mother is standing here of her own free will, and there is nothing on this table left to sell." The room was so silent I could hear a lemon drop in the courtyard beyond the shutters. And then Renzo Malisse, because a poisoned man reaches for poison, said, or a servant sees a soft dawn and invents a bloodline to climb. He said, "Prove it. Gray eyes are common. A gesture is a trick. Where is the blood?" That was when Emme came into the hall. Betta brought her. I had not asked her to, and I will thank her for it the rest of my life. She brought my grave little girl in through the side door into that hall full of dangerous men. And Emme stood in a bar of hot gold light on the black and white floor. And she looked around the loud, strange room. And she pressed 2 fingers to the hollow of her own throat. And then she looked down the long table. And she saw, at the head of it, the woman from the dry fountain, her mama's friend. And she went still all over with that held joy. And she reached out toward her, small, the way she had reached from the wagon, the way she had reached across a whole season. And Vittoria Rask stood up, She came down the length of that table, past every dangerous man in her family, and she crouched down in the bar of hot light in front of my daughter, down to her level, the way she always did. And for the first time all season, the first time ever, she did not hold the distance. She reached out and she took Emme's small reaching hand in her own scarred one, and she held it, and she looked at the gray eyes and the coal that were her own gray eyes and her own coal, and she said to the child, but loud enough for the whole account hall of the Rask family to hear it, she said, "Blood, not coin." And then she looked up, past Emme, at me, standing there with my mother's button open in my hand, and she said it to me, the second time, and it meant something different now. It meant everything different now. Blood, not coin. She had never taken us for the debt. She had taken us because we were the only blood she had left in the world, and she had been too afraid to say it, and I had said it for her, in front of everyone, and made it free. Renzo Melise did not speak again. There is no move against a Dawn who has declared her blood in open counsel with the child's own hand in hers, and the mother choosing freely and the whole family watching. He had wanted to expose a Dawn who could be moved. Instead, he had made her stand up and be seen choosing to be moved, in the open, of her own will, which is not weakness, which is the opposite of weakness, which is the only strength that a room full of men who take can never understand and can never touch. By nightfall, he was gone from the Quays. But I am getting ahead. We did not touch, Vittoria and I, in the account hall. That was not the place. There were still hours of it, the family, the accounts, the ugly machinery of a household grinding itself around a thing that had changed at its center. It was full dark before the house emptied of it, before the last of them had gone, before I found her alone in the dry room off the courtyard, standing among my father's clocks in the lamplight with her back to the door. She had the stopped watch in her hand. I came in and she turned, and for a moment neither of us said anything, and all the clocks ticked around us, all the small mended hearts keeping their 100 times. And I could see that she did not know how to do this part, that the taking she knew, and the holding she knew, but the being chosen she had no map for, none. She was a woman who had paid for everything her whole life and did not know how to simply be given a thing. And she stood there in the lamplight with her scarred hand around a stopped watch, and she was, I think, more afraid than she had been at any point that whole season, because there was nothing left to hold the distance with. I crossed the room. I did the thing she could not do. I closed the distance, all of it, the 1 step wide and the 3 winters deep, and I stood in front of her among the ticking clocks and I held out my hand. I said, "Give it to me." She looked at the watch. She looked at me. And Vittoria Rask, the Dawn of the family that owned the tide, who had carried a stop thing next to her heart for 3 winters rather than let anyone buy her a start, put the gold hunter watch into my open hand, freely, the first free thing I ever saw her give. I opened it. I knew this watch. I had known it in a storm. The mainspring had gone again, the same as before, and I set it and I wound it. There in the lamplight with her watching my hands the way she always watched my hands, and I felt the whole mechanism take the tension and hold. And then I closed the case and I gave it back to her. And in her palm, in the quiet of the dry room, it began to tick. Small, true, alive. She looked down at it, running in her hand, and something broke in her face that had been holding for 3 winters, and she looked up at me. And this time, when she reached out, she did not stop. Her scarred hand came up, and her fingers found the line of my jaw, and she did not raise her voice. She never raised her voice. She said my name, just my name, Cosima, the way you set a stone down where it cannot be argued with. And I felt her thumb at my cheekbone, and I stepped in, and she rested her forehead against mine, and the watch ticked between us, and that was all. That was everything. A body's length closed at last, a stopped thing running, a scar and a button and a coal, and my grave little girl asleep down the colonnade in a cot the dawn of the Rask family had ordered made before she ever let herself say why. Neither of us said anything for a long time. We did not need to. We had said everything we had in 100 broken clocks left in the dark and mended by morning all season long. This was just the last of them, the two of us, mended at last, ticking clean and true in the lamplight. There is more of that night. There are parts of it I could not show you here. If you want to know what really happened between them, the parts I couldn't show, the full uncut chapter is waiting on my Patreon, link in the description. We stayed in Verano. Casa Rask changed around us, the way a house changes around what lives at its center. The dry fountain runs now. Vittoria had it mended in the first month, water again in the marble basin, and Emme drops lemon leaves in it and watches them turn, grave and delighted, 2 fingers at her throat. My father's clocks came up out of the dry room and into the house, all of them. And Casa Rask ticks now, 100 small hearts keeping 100 times. And the dawn of the Rask family sleeps for the first time in her life, in a house full of the sound of running time, and she told me once, only once, in the dark, that she had not known a house could sound like that, like it is not waiting for anything, like it is just going on. The stopped watch is not stopped. It sits on the mantel in our room, ticking, and I wind it every 7 days, and I will wind it every 7 days for the rest of my life. And neither of us has ever once called it anything but ours. Renzo Malise is gone. Others tried that first year, the way they try a Don, who has shown a soft place. They learned what I learned in the account hall, that it is not a soft place at all, that a woman who has been chosen freely in open council is harder to move than any woman who has only ever been feared, because now there is a thing she is not afraid to lose out loud. And a person with nothing left to hide is the most dangerous person in any room. They stopped trying. Verano is quiet now. Quiet the way the deep water is quiet. The mother-of-pearl button is sewn back where it belongs. I found the coat, that first winter. Black wool, the one I had mended a dozen times in the room off the courtyard before I ever knew whose it was. And there was a button gone from the throat of it, gone for years. And it was the mate of mine. The exact mate, mother-of-pearl worn smooth as a coin. And I have stopped being surprised by things like that. I sewed my mother's button onto the throat of Vittoria's coat with my own hands. In the room off the courtyard where I had first mended that coat as a bonded stranger. And I took my time over the stitches. And she stood very still and let me, the way she had learned that season to let me do the small close things. And now she carries the last thing I have of my mother over her heart. And I carry the running watch, and Emme carries the coal in her eye that came down from a storm 3 winters deep. And we are, all 3 of us, each holding the one thing the others gave. Emme is 4 now. She still counts. She still goes grave and still when a room gets loud, and presses 2 fingers to the hollow of her throat, and across the room, without seeming to know she does it, the dawn of the Rask family presses her thumb to the crown of a watch that runs now, and the 2 of them hold on to themselves and each other in a loud world, and I watch them, and I have never in my life been so unafraid. People ask, the ones who dare, how the dawn of Verano came to have a northern watchmender at her side and a grave gray-eyed girl on her knee, and Vittoria never explains it, because she is still a woman of very few words and she never wastes one. She just looks at whoever asked, with the gray and the coal, and she tells them the only true thing, the 4 words she said to a man beside a wagon at first light, and to a child in a bar of hot gold light, and to me among the ticking clocks. The 4 words that were never once about a debt.
She says blood, not coin.